The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Robert Chen's penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Robert stood by the window, coffee cup in hand, looking down at the city that had made him rich. At 58, he had everything money could buy: the penthouse, vacation homes in 3 countries, and a collection of cars worth more than what most people earned in a lifetime. But something felt empty. Robert took a sip of his coffee and frowned. Last night's charity gala had left him with a bad taste in his mouth. He'd watched as Seattle's elite wrote checks with many zeros, posed for photos, and then spent the rest of the evening networking and bragging about their summer plans. Not once had he heard anyone discuss the actual cause they were supposedly supporting: a shelter for families experiencing homelessness. Another day, another tax write-off, Robert muttered to himself. He placed his cup down and walked over to his desk, where a stack of thank you letters sat waiting for his signature. His assistant had prepared them after he'd donated $2 million to various charities last month. The gesture had made headlines in the local business section: "Tech mogul continues generous giving streak." But the headlines didn't tell the whole story. Robert's generosity had started with genuine intentions years ago, but lately, he'd begun to question if his money was actually making a difference or just padding the administrative costs of well-connected organizations. His phone buzzed, a text from his wealth manager asking about an investment opportunity. Robert ignored it and instead opened his laptop. He found himself typing "Does genuine kindness still exist?" into the search bar. He chuckled at himself, a 60-year-old millionaire searching the internet for answers to life's big questions. The search results led him to a documentary about homelessness in America. He clicked play, intending to watch just a few minutes before starting his workday. 2 hours later, Robert was still watching. The stories of people who had lost everything, jobs, homes, families, struck him deeply. But what surprised him most were the moments of community and kindness among those with nothing. People sharing their last dollar, watching each other's belongings, creating family-like bonds on the streets. One segment featured a man who had been a financial analyst before a mental health crisis, and medical bills had left him homeless. "The hardest part," the man said, looking directly into the camera, "isn't going hungry or sleeping outside. It's becoming invisible. People look right through you like you don't exist anymore." Those words hit Robert like a physical blow. How many times had he walked past homeless people without really seeing them? He closed his laptop and walked to the window again. From his penthouse, the people on the streets below looked like tiny moving dots. He couldn't make out their faces or expressions. They were essentially invisible to him up here. Robert made a sudden decision. He needed to see for himself, not from his ivory tower, not through the filter of charity galas and tax-deductible donations, but up close. He needed to know if true kindness still existed in a world that seemed increasingly cold and transactional. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Tom, I need you to clear my calendar for the next 2 weeks." "Sir?" "You have the board meeting on Thursday and the tech conference next week where you're the keynote speaker. Cancel everything." "Family emergency," Robert said, surprising himself with the lie. "Is everything all right?" "Do you need anything?" Tom asked, concern evident in his voice. "No, I'll be fine. Just need some time. And Tom, I'll be unreachable for a while. Don't worry if you can't get hold of me." After ending the call, Robert sat down and began to plan. He couldn't just walk onto the streets looking like himself. He'd need a disguise, a new identity. He'd need to blend in. His first stop was a thrift store in a neighborhood he'd never visited before. He felt oddly nervous as he walked in, aware of how his expensive watch and tailored clothes made him stand out. He selected several items: worn jeans with a small tear in one knee, an old flannel shirt, a faded jacket, and scuffed boots a size too big. Next, he visited a costume supply store where he purchased spirit gum, facial hair, and makeup that would age him further and change his appearance. The young cashier assumed he was preparing for a theatrical production and gave him tips on application. Back at his penthouse, Robert packed a small backpack with his new clothes, some basic toiletries, and a thin blanket. He considered what else to bring. Money would be tricky. He couldn't appear too well off. But he also couldn't put himself in real danger. He decided on bringing just enough cash for emergencies, hidden in various places, and a prepaid phone that couldn't be traced back to him. He would leave his credit cards, ID, and regular phone behind. As evening approached, Robert stood in front of his bathroom mirror and began his transformation. He applied the spirit gum and attached the patchy gray beard. With makeup, he deepened the lines around his eyes and mouth, added some age spots, and made his skin appear weathered. He messed his normally perfectly styled hair and added some temporary gray dye. When he put on the thrift store clothes, the transformation was striking. Gone was Robert Chen, the tech millionaire who graced the covers of business magazines. In his place stood an aging man who looked like he'd had a hard life. "Hello?" he said to his reflection, testing a voice rougher and lower than his own. "My name is—" He hadn't thought of a name yet. "My name is Ray," he decided, thinking of his father, Raymond, who had grown up poor but worked tirelessly to give Robert opportunities he never had. Robert, now Ray, spent the night in his penthouse, sleeping on the floor rather than his expensive mattress to prepare his body for what was to come. He left early the next morning, taking the service elevator down to avoid his building's security staff, who would certainly recognize him. The morning air felt different somehow as he stepped onto the sidewalk. People rushed past him, already busy with their day. A woman in a business suit nearly collided with him, then stepped around without a word or glance. Already, he was becoming invisible. Ray walked for nearly an hour until he reached a neighborhood known for its homeless population. His heart raced as he approached a small park where several people had set up makeshift camps. What exactly was he doing here? Was this experiment foolish or even disrespectful? He almost turned back, but the memory of the man in the documentary stopped him. People look right through you like you don't exist anymore. He needed to know what that felt like. Ray found a bench and sat down, placing his backpack beside him. He watched as the park came to life around him. City workers arrived to clean the public bathrooms. A police officer drove by slowly, eyeing the homeless individuals with suspicion. A church group arrived with a folding table and began setting up what appeared to be a breakfast service. After an hour of sitting, Ray's back began to ache. He was used to his ergonomic office chair, not a hard bench. A small discomfort, he reminded himself, compared to what others endured every day. He decided to join the line that had formed at the church group's table. His stomach growled. He'd been too nervous to eat breakfast before leaving. As he approached the line, he felt a flutter of anxiety. Would they see through his disguise? Would they somehow know he didn't belong? An older woman with kind eyes handed him a paper cup of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "God bless you," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a practiced phrase, Ray realized, one she probably said hundreds of times each morning. "Thank you," Ray replied, keeping his voice low. He took his breakfast back to the bench and slowly ate, savoring the simple meal more than any fancy restaurant dinner in recent memory. As he ate, he observed the others in the park. Some ate alone, while others shared conversation and laughter. A tall man divided his sandwich and gave half to a small dog peeking out from his coat. By midday, Ray had moved from the park to a busy street corner near the public library. He sat on the ground, his back against a building, and placed his cup from breakfast in front of him with a few coins inside. Part of his experiment. People streamed past him on the sidewalk. Business people, tourists, students, families. Almost no one looked at him. Those who did quickly averted their eyes. He became acutely aware of being simultaneously visible and invisible. A body occupying space that others had to navigate around, but not a person worthy of acknowledgement. The hours passed slowly. The concrete sidewalk grew uncomfortable. The noise of the city, once the soundtrack of his success, now seemed harsh and overwhelming without the buffer of luxury. By evening, exactly 7 people had dropped coins into his cup. 2 had muttered "good luck" or "God bless." Not one had made eye contact or asked his name. As the streetlights came on, Ray gathered his meager belongings and his cup of coins. He had a decision to make. He could return to his penthouse, shower off the grime of the day, and sleep in his own bed. Or he could continue his experiment, find a shelter, and truly experience what it meant to be homeless. Ray closed his eyes briefly, thinking of his warm penthouse waiting just a few miles away. Then he remembered why he had started this journey. He needed answers that couldn't be found in a single day of playing pretend. With a deep breath, Ray joined the small group of people walking toward the nearby shelter, wondering what tomorrow would bring and who he might meet along the way. For the first time in years, Robert Chen wasn't in control of what happened next. And strangely, that felt more real than anything in his recent memory. The line outside the shelter stretched down the block. Ray stood quietly among the others, clutching his backpack to his chest. The evening air had turned chilly, and he pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders. He hadn't expected the wait to be so long, or the anxiety that came with not knowing if there would be enough beds for everyone. "First time?" asked a voice beside him. Ray turned to see a woman probably in her 40s, though hardship had aged her face beyond her years. She wore several layers of clothing despite the mild spring weather, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes, however, held a warmth that surprised him. "Is it that obvious?" Ray asked. She smiled slightly. "You're holding that backpack like it might run away." "Rookies always do that. Name's Grace." "Ray," he replied, relaxing his grip slightly on his bag. "Any tips for a rookie?" Grace looked him over. "Keep your shoes on when you sleep. Put your backpack under your head as a pillow. Don't make eye contact with anyone who seems off. Most folks are decent, just down on their luck, but there are a few you want to avoid." Ray nodded, taking mental notes. "Thanks. Will there be enough beds?" Grace checked her watch, a cheap plastic thing with a cracked face. "Tuesday's usually okay. Weekends are worse. Government checks come at the start of the month, so more people get rooms then. End of the month is hardest." The line shuffled forward slowly. As they approached the entrance, Ray noticed the tired-looking staff checking people in, asking for IDs when available. His stomach knotted. He hadn't brought any identification, a major oversight in his planning. When it was his turn, a young man with dark circles under his eyes asked, "Name?" "Ray," he answered, then added, "Ray Johnson." The fake last name came easily to his lips. "ID?" Ray shook his head. "Lost everything in a fire a few weeks back." The young man barely reacted, just made a note on his clipboard. "Any medical conditions we should know about?" "Taking any medications?" "No." "Any history of violence or restraining orders against you?" "No." "Any alcohol or substances in your possession?" "No." The young man handed him a thin towel and a small plastic bag containing toiletries. "Bed 43, breakfast is at 6:30. You need to be out by 8 a.m. Ray took the items, mumbling thanks, and moved inside. The shelter was housed in what appeared to be an old gymnasium. Rows of cots lined the floor, each with a thin mattress and blanket. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and too many bodies in too small a space. He found bed 43 and sat down, placing his backpack between his feet. The mattress sagged beneath his weight. All around him, people were settling in for the night, removing shoes, arranging their few possessions, some already lying down with blankets pulled over their heads to block out the fluorescent light still blazing overhead. Grace had ended up across the room in the women's section. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod. Ray returned the gesture, grateful for the one familiar face in this sea of strangers. A man in his 60s took the bed next to Ray's. He moved slowly, wincing as he bent to untie his shoes. "Back acting up again, Joe," called someone from a few beds down. "When isn't it?" the man replied with a grimace. He noticed Ray watching and extended a weathered hand. "Joe Matthews. 30 years construction, now my spine's more metal than bone." Ray shook his hand. "Ray Johnson. Sorry about your back," Joe shrugged. "That's life, ain't it? You work yourself to the bone, then the bone breaks. Company insurance dropped me after the third surgery. Couldn't work, couldn't pay rent. Here I am." He said it matter-of-factly without self-pity. Ray swallowed hard. "That's rough. Could be worse," Joe replied, settling onto his cot. "Met some good people out here. Plus I get to sleep indoors tonight. That's something." The lights dimmed at 10 p.m. Ray lay awake listening to the sounds of the shelter. Snoring, coughing, occasional murmurs, someone crying softly a few beds away. The cot was uncomfortable, the blanket thin and scratchy. He thought of his king-sized bed at home with its expensive mattress and high thread count sheets. Sleep came fitfully, in short bursts interrupted by unfamiliar noises. At one point, a loud argument broke out near the entrance and security had to intervene. Ray kept his eyes closed, following Grace's advice to avoid making eye contact with trouble. He woke to the sound of movement and fluorescent lights flickering back to full brightness. For a moment he was disoriented, forgetting where he was. Then reality rushed back. He sat up, rubbing his stiff neck. Rise and shine, Princess, Joe said, already sitting on the edge of his cot, pulling on his boots. Breakfast goes fast. Better hurry. Ray followed the crowd to a small cafeteria area where volunteers served powdered eggs, toast, and coffee. The food was bland but hot, and Ray found himself hungrier than expected. He sat at a crowded table, listening to conversations around him. People discussed where they might spend the day, which public bathrooms were cleanest, which library security guards were lenient about napping. They shared information about job opportunities, free medical clinics, and places giving away clothing. It was a parallel world with its own economy of information and resources. At 8 a.m., they were ushered out onto the street. The day was bright and cool, the city coming alive with morning commuters hurrying to work, coffee shops opening their doors, buses rumbling past. Ray stood on the sidewalk, uncertain what to do next. In his normal life, his days were structured around meetings, calls, decisions. Here, the empty hours stretched before him like an unfamiliar landscape. Got plans? Grace appeared beside him, adjusting a worn backpack over her shoulder. Not really, Ray admitted. The library opens at 9. It's warm, has bathrooms, and nobody bothers you if you're quiet. I'm heading there if you want to come. Ray nodded gratefully and fell into step beside her. As they walked, Grace pointed out landmarks of her world. Which restaurants put unspoiled food in accessible dumpsters? Which coffee shops might let you use their bathroom without buying anything? Which corners were best for panhandling? How long have you been? Ray trailed off, unsure how to phrase it politely. Homeless, Grace supplied. Going on 8 months now. Lost my job when the restaurant closed. Couldn't make rent. My daughter's helping when she can, but she's got 2 kids and barely making ends meet herself. I'm sorry, Ray said, meaning it. Grace shrugged. It happens. I've put in applications everywhere, but nobody wants to hire a 52-year-old waitress with arthritis. I'll figure something out. Always do. They reached the library and found seats in a quiet corner. Grace pulled out a paperback from her bag, a well-worn romance novel with a cracked spine. Reading keeps me sane, she explained. Ray pretended to browse magazines while observing the others in the library. There were clearly regulars, homeless individuals who knew the best spots, who had established relationships with the staff. They moved with the practiced ease of people who had made this public space into something of a home. Around noon, his stomach began to growl. Is there somewhere nearby to get lunch? He asked Grace. Soup Kitchen 3 blocks over opens at 12:30, she replied without looking up from her book. It's decent. The Church on Pine does sandwiches on Wednesdays, but that's tomorrow. They walked to the soup kitchen together. The line was already forming when they arrived, and Ray was struck by the diversity of people waiting, young and old, different ethnicities, some clearly mentally ill, others who looked like they could be office workers on their lunch break if not for their worn clothing. The meal was simple: vegetable soup, half a sandwich, an apple, and water. Ray sat with Grace at a crowded table, eating slowly, savoring each bite in a way he never did at expensive restaurants. A volunteer came by, dropping flyers on the tables. Job fair next Tuesday at the community center, she announced. They're specifically looking to hire people experiencing homelessness. Temp positions mostly, but it's something. Grace picked up a flyer, studying it with interest. Could be my chance, she murmured. After lunch, they returned to the library until closing time. As evening approached, Grace mentioned another shelter on the other side of town that she preferred when she could get in. Women's only. Feels safer. They parted ways at a bus stop, Grace heading for her shelter, Ray uncertain where to go. Good luck, Ray, she said. Maybe see you at the library tomorrow? Yeah, maybe, he replied, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye to the one person who had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. As Grace's bus pulled away, Ray stood on the corner, watching the city transform as day shifted to evening. Office workers hurried home. Restaurants filled with dinner crowds, lights came on in apartment windows. All these lives continuing as normal while he stood outside looking in, exactly as he had done to others before this experiment began. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years he had been technically among the homeless population as he walked from his office to his favorite lunch spots, but he had never truly seen them. Now, just one day into his experience, he was beginning to understand what it meant to be unseen. Ray found a bench and sat down, considering his options for the night. He could return to the same shelter or try a different one. He could reveal his true identity and go home to his penthouse, or he could continue this journey and see where it led him tomorrow. As the streetlights flickered on, Ray made his decision. He would stay. Something about Grace's quiet dignity and Joe's matter-of-fact acceptance of his circumstances had touched something in him. There were stories here that needed to be heard, lives that deserved to be acknowledged. For perhaps the first time in decades, Robert Chen wasn't thinking about business strategies or investment opportunities. He was thinking about people, their struggles, their resilience, and what he might learn from them if he just took the time to listen. By the 5th day of his experiment, Ray had established something of a routine. He woke early at whichever shelter he'd managed to secure a bed in, ate a quick breakfast, and headed to the library when it opened. He would spend hours there, reading newspapers and books, occasionally striking up conversations with other regulars. In the afternoons, he would find a soup kitchen for lunch or sit on a busy street corner with his cup out, practicing the art of being visible enough for spare change but invisible enough not to make passers-by uncomfortable. The physical discomforts were mounting. His back ached from the shelter cots. His feet had developed blisters from all the walking, and he was constantly either too hot or too cold. But worse than the physical discomfort was the emotional toll. Each dismissive glance, each person who crossed the street to avoid him, each security guard who asked him to move along, they all chipped away at something deep inside him. "You get used to it," Grace had told him when he mentioned this feeling. They had met up at the library several times, and Ray had come to value her practical wisdom. After a while, you build a shell. The looks still sting, but not as bad. Ray didn't want to get used to it. He couldn't imagine Grace or Joe or any of the others he'd met becoming numb to being treated as less than human. Today, he sat in a small park watching people on their lunch breaks. Office workers in pressed clothes sat on benches eating salads from plastic containers, scrolling through their phones, oblivious to his presence on a nearby bench. Ray recognized the type. He had been one of them not long ago, perhaps even more oblivious than most due to his wealth and position. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice when someone sat down beside him. "Mind if I join you?" It was Grace unwrapping a sandwich from the church donation table. "Of course not," Ray replied, genuinely happy to see her. "How was your morning?" "Productive," she said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Had an interview at that hotel I mentioned. Housekeeper position." Ray perked up. "That's great. How did it go?" Grace shrugged, but he could see hope in her eyes. "Okay, I think. They seemed concerned about my housing situation, but said they'd call me." She patted her pocket where Ray knew she kept a basic flip phone, her lifeline to her daughter and potential employers. "They'd be lucky to have you," Ray said, meaning it. In their few days of acquaintance, he'd observed Grace's meticulous nature, from how she organized her few belongings to how she always cleaned up after herself wherever they went. "We'll see," she said pragmatically. "What about you? Any luck with work?" Ray had been vague about his background, saying only that he'd lost his job and then his apartment after an illness drained his savings. It wasn't entirely untrue. His father had followed that exact path before rebuilding his life. "Not yet," he answered. "Still looking?" Grace nodded, then reached into her bag. "Almost forgot. Brought you something." She handed him a small tube of ointment for those blisters. "Noticed you limping yesterday." Ray stared at the tube, oddly touched by the simple gesture. It couldn't have cost more than a few dollars, but for Grace, that represented a significant portion of whatever money she had. And yet she had thought of his discomfort and acted to ease it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "That's what friends do," she replied simply. "Put some on tonight before you sleep." They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the office workers return to their buildings as lunch hour ended. The park grew quieter, with just a few elderly people and parents with young children remaining. "I've been thinking," Grace said suddenly. "The women's shelter is getting a new batch of donations tomorrow. Might be some clothes that would fit you better." "That jacket's too thin for the weather we've been having." Before Ray could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion nearby. A park maintenance worker was arguing with an elderly homeless man who had been dozing on a bench. "You can't sleep here," the worker was saying loudly. "There are kids around. Move along." The elderly man, who Ray recognized from one of the shelters, was struggling to gather his belongings, dropping things in his haste and confusion. Without hesitation, Grace stood up and walked over. "He wasn't bothering anyone," she said firmly to the maintenance worker. "He's just resting his eyes." "Rules are rules, lady," the worker replied dismissively. "No sleeping in the park. He's leaving now, see?" Grace had begun helping the elderly man with his bags. No need to make a scene. Ray watched, impressed by Grace's intervention. She showed no fear or hesitation in standing up for someone more vulnerable than herself, despite her own precarious situation. After a moment's hesitation, he got up and joined her, helping gather the man's scattered possessions. The maintenance worker, outnumbered now, shrugged and walked away, muttering under his breath about these people. "Thank you. Thank you," the elderly man kept saying, his hands shaking as he clutched his bags. "I was just so tired. Didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't cause anything, Harold," Grace assured him gently. "Some people just need to feel important by pushing others around." Ray helped Harold organize his things and offered to walk with him to a nearby day center where he could rest indoors. Harold accepted gratefully, and the three of them set off together. As they walked, Harold told them fragments of his story. He'd been a teacher once, had a family, a house in the suburbs. Mental illness had taken it all from him gradually, until he'd ended up on the streets. He spoke of his past life with a detached wonder, as if describing someone else's experiences. At the day center, a tired-looking staff member greeted Harold by name and helped him to a chair in the corner. Grace made sure he was settled before rejoining Ray outside. He was a high school English teacher for 30 years, she told Ray as they walked away. "Brilliant man. Knows whole Shakespeare plays by heart. But when his illness got bad, everyone disappeared. The school, his friends, eventually even his family. Now he can barely remember to take his medication." Ray shook his head, trying to process the injustice of it. A dedicated teacher, someone who had shaped young minds for decades, now couldn't even rest on a park bench without being harassed. "It's not right," he said finally. "No," Grace agreed. "It's not. But that's why we look out for each other." She checked her watch. "I should go. Gotta check my voicemail, see if that hotel called." "Of course," Ray nodded. "I hope they did." "Me too. Oh, almost forgot. There's a community dinner at the church tonight. Real food, not just soup. Starts at 6 if you want to come." After Grace left, Ray found himself wandering toward the business district of the city. Without fully realizing it, he was heading toward his company headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper of glass and steel. He stopped across the street, watching people enter and exit, employees he probably knew, perhaps even some who reported directly to him. He hadn't thought about his company much these past days, which was surprising given how it had dominated his life for so long. Standing there now, he felt strangely disconnected from that world of boardrooms and balance sheets. A security guard near the entrance had noticed him watching and began walking toward him with a purposeful stride. Ray turned and walked away before being confronted. Another small humiliation to add to the growing list. By the time Ray arrived at the church for dinner, the line stretched down the block. He spotted Grace near the front, talking with an older woman holding a clipboard. When Grace saw him, she waved him over. "This is my friend I was telling you about," she said to the clipboard woman. "He's new to the area." The woman nodded and made a note. "We're short volunteers tonight. Either of you interested in helping serve instead of just eating? You'd get a meal at the end." "I'll do it," Ray said immediately, surprising himself. "Me too," added Grace. They were given plastic aprons and stationed behind the serving tables. For the next 2 hours, Ray dished out mashed potatoes and green beans to a steady stream of people, families with children, elderly individuals, young adults, people clearly suffering from addiction or mental illness. He made eye contact with each person, smiled, and offered an extra roll or larger portion when he could. For the first time in days, he felt useful. The simple act of serving food with dignity made him feel human again in a way he hadn't expected. At the end of the night, as they ate their own meals in the now quiet hall, Grace nudged him. "You're good at this," she observed. "Ever worked food service before?" "No," Ray admitted, "but it felt good to help." "That's the secret they don't tell you," Grace said, wiping her plate with the last of her roll. "When you've got nothing, giving becomes more important, not less. Giving what you can, time, a kind word, half a sandwich, it reminds you that you're still human, still worth something." Ray considered her words carefully. His millions in charitable donations had never given him the sense of purpose he'd felt tonight, serving potatoes to strangers. The realization was both humbling and illuminating. The hotel called, by the way, Grace mentioned casually. Ray looked up eagerly, and a smile spread across her face, the first full genuine smile he'd seen from her. I start Monday. Minimum wage but includes a bus pass. And if I stay 3 months, they have employee housing I might qualify for. That's wonderful, Ray exclaimed, resisting the urge to hug her. I knew you could do it. It's just housekeeping, she said modestly. It's a start, Ray replied. And from what I've seen, once you get started, there's no stopping you. They parted ways outside the church, Grace heading to the women's shelter, Ray to try his luck at the men's shelter across town. As they said goodbye, Ray realized this experiment had become more than just a test of human kindness. It had become a lesson in human dignity, in the quiet strength of people like Grace who held on to their humanity, despite everything the world did to take it from them. And for the first time, he began to wonder if his real identity, billionaire Robert Chen, was actually the disguise he'd been wearing all these years. 10 days into his experiment, Ray woke before dawn in the men's shelter. The coughing and snoring around him had become familiar background noise. He'd secured the same cot 3 nights in a row, a small victory in the unpredictable world of shelter living. As he lay there in the dim light, Ray realized his time was running short. He'd told his assistant he'd be gone for 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks were nearly up. Soon he would need to make decisions about returning to his real life. The thought filled him with unexpected anxiety. Going back meant hot showers whenever he wanted, sleeping in his own bed, eating good food. But it also meant leaving behind the people he'd met, particularly Grace, whose friendship had come to mean more to him than he could have imagined. More troubling was the question of what he would do with everything he'd learned. Could he simply return to his penthouse and resume his old life as if none of this had happened? The idea felt impossible now. At breakfast, Ray spotted Joe sitting alone at a corner table. He grabbed his tray of toast and powdered eggs and joined the older man. Morning, Joe greeted him with a nod. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, Ray admitted. Too much on my mind. Joe studied him for a moment. You're different from most first-timers I meet out here. Most are still shell-shocked, angry at the world. You're watchful, like you're trying to figure something out. Ray hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. I'm trying to understand how the system works. Or doesn't work, I guess. Joe laughed, a dry sound with little humor. Good luck with that. Been out here 3 years and I still don't understand it. How do people survive? Ray asked. Long-term, I mean. Some don't, Joe replied bluntly. The street takes them. Illness, addiction, violence. Others get help from family eventually, or find programs that actually work. A lucky few climb out on their own like your friend Grace might be doing. And you? Joe shrugged. I'm stubborn. Applied for disability 16 times before they approved it. Check comes next month. Might be enough for a room somewhere if I'm careful. Ray felt a surge of relief at this news. That's great, Joe. Really great. We'll see. Doesn't solve the bigger problem, though. Which is? Joe gestured around the room at the dozens of men eating breakfast. All of this. The way people fall through the cracks. The way the rest of the world stops seeing us as human. That's the real sickness, you know? Not my back. Not Harold's mental health, not whatever put you on the streets. It's the way society decides some people just don't matter. Ray had no response to this hard truth. He finished his breakfast in thoughtful silence. Outside, the day was unusually warm and bright. Ray decided to head to the park where he often met Grace in the afternoons. He had some time to kill before then, so he found a sunny bench and closed his eyes, enjoying the simple pleasure of warmth on his face. Excuse me, sir? Are you Ray? He opened his eyes to find a young woman in a shelter staff uniform standing before him. He recognized her from the intake desk at the men's shelter. Yes, that's me, he answered, immediately concerned. Had something happened to Joe or one of the others? There's a woman looking for you, Grace from the women's shelter. She asked me to find you. Said it was important. Ray's concern deepened. Is she okay? Seemed fine. Said to tell you she'd be at St. Mary's Church at noon if you could meet her there. Something about a surprise. Ray thanked her and checked the time on a nearby bank sign. It was just past 11 a.m. St. Mary's was about a 20-minute walk away. He arrived at the church a few minutes before noon, It was a grand old building with stone steps leading up to heavy wooden doors. Outside, a small group of people stood chatting. Ray scanned their faces for Grace but didn't see her. "Ray, over here." He turned to see Grace hurrying toward him from across the street. She looked different. Her hair was neatly styled and she wore clean, pressed clothes he hadn't seen before. She carried a small shopping bag. "What's going on?" he asked when she reached him. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's great," she replied, slightly breathless. "I started the hotel job yesterday. They had me shadow someone, but I'm starting for real tomorrow morning." "That's wonderful," Ray said warmly. "Is that why you wanted to meet? To tell me about the job?" "Partly," Grace admitted. "But also because of this." She handed him the shopping bag. "Go on, open it. Inside." Ray found a neatly folded white dress shirt, a blue tie, and a voucher for a free haircut at a nearby barber college. "I don't understand," he said, confused. Grace beamed at him. "The hotel has another opening for a night desk clerk. Basic stuff, checking guests in, answering the phone. The manager mentioned it when she saw how good I was with paperwork. I told her about you and she said you could come in for an interview tomorrow." Ray stared at her, momentarily speechless. In all his years of business, all his philanthropy efforts, no one had ever done something so personally thoughtful for him. "You did this for me?" he finally managed. Grace nodded. "The clothes are from the church donation center. The lady who runs it helped me find your size. The haircut voucher is from a program for job seekers." She suddenly looked uncertain. "Is it okay?" "I thought, you've been so kind helping me and others. You deserve a chance too." A lump formed in Ray's throat. Here was Grace, who had so little herself, who was just beginning to climb out of homelessness, using her first connections and resources not for herself but to help him. "It's more than okay," he said softly. "It's the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." Relief washed over her face. "Good. The interview is at 2 p.m. tomorrow." I wrote down the address. She handed him a slip of paper. "The manager's name is Linda. Just be honest with her about your situation. She's good people." As they walked together toward a nearby park, Ray felt the weight of his deception more heavily than ever. Grace believed she was helping a homeless man get back on his feet, but he was living a lie. Soon he would return to his real life as Robert Chen, wealthy businessman. The thought made him deeply uncomfortable. They sat on a bench eating sandwiches Grace had brought. She talked excitedly about her first day at work, the people she'd met, how good it felt to be doing something productive again. "The best part is they have this employee housing program," she explained. "After 3 months, if they like your work, you can apply for a subsidized apartment near the hotel. Real affordable, utilities included." "That's amazing," Ray said. "You'll be back on your feet in no time." Grace nodded, then grew serious. "I've been thinking about what comes next. Not just for me, but for others like us. There are so many people out there with skills and determination who just need one break, one opportunity." "What are you thinking?" Ray asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know exactly. Some kind of network, maybe? A way for people who make it out to help those still struggling? The hardest part of being homeless is feeling like nobody cares if you live or die. What if we created a community that proved that wrong?" Ray listened, impressed by her vision and practical compassion. In his boardroom, he'd heard countless pitches from people seeking funding for homeless initiatives, but none had spoken with the authentic understanding that Grace possessed. "It's a powerful idea," he said. "Start small, maybe? Help one person who then helps another?" "Exactly." Grace's eyes lit up. A chain of support. It wouldn't take much. Just people willing to remember where they came from and reach back to help others forward. As the afternoon wore on, they brainstormed together. Grace's practical knowledge of homeless services combined with Ray's business instincts, which he tried to downplay, created something exciting. By the time they parted ways, they had the outline of a mentorship program that seemed genuinely promising. "Don't forget your interview tomorrow," Grace reminded him as they said goodbye. "You'll do great." "Thanks to you," Ray replied sincerely. Walking back to the shelter that evening, Ray made a decision. It was time to end his experiment. He couldn't continue deceiving Grace and the others who had shown him such genuine kindness. But more importantly, he couldn't return to his old life without trying to create meaningful change with the knowledge he'd gained. Back at the shelter, Ray found a quiet corner and pulled out his emergency prepaid phone. He turned it on for the first time since his experiment began and dialed his assistant's number. "Tom speaking," came the familiar voice. "Tom, it's me." Ray said quietly. Mr. Chen. The relief in Tom's voice was palpable. Thank goodness. Are you all right? Should I send a car? I'm fine, Ray assured him. But I need you to do something for me. Tomorrow morning, I want you to set up a meeting with the full board for the day after. Tell them I'm coming back with a new direction for the company foundation. Of course, Tom replied, clearly confused, but professional as always. Anything else? Ray thought of Grace, of Joe, of Harold, of all the others he'd met whose lives could be transformed with the right support at the right moment. Yes, he said firmly. I want you to research a hotel downtown, the Westbrook. Find out everything you can about their employee housing program, and start looking into property acquisitions in the area. Buildings that could be converted to affordable housing. May I ask what this is about, sir? Tom ventured. Ray smiled to himself. It's about remembering what really matters, Tom, and using what we have to make a real difference. After ending the call, Ray sat for a long time, planning his next steps. Tomorrow he would keep his promise to Grace and go to the interview, not to take the job, but to learn more about the hotel's approach to hiring those experiencing homelessness. Then the day after, he would return to his company and begin the work of true change. For the first time in years, Robert Chen felt a sense of genuine purpose. His experiment had begun as a test of human kindness, but had transformed into something far more significant, a chance to rebuild not just his understanding of homelessness, but the very foundation of how he used his wealth and influence as he settled onto his cot for one of his final nights in the shelter. Ray realized he was actually looking forward to tomorrow's job interview. Not for himself, but for what it might teach him about creating pathways out of poverty that respected the dignity and potential of people like Grace. Ray stood outside the Westbrook Hotel, tugging at the collar of his borrowed dress shirt. The white fabric felt stiff and formal after days in his worn flannel and jacket. He'd visited the barber college that morning, and his hair and beard were now neatly trimmed. Looking at his reflection in the hotel's glass doors, he barely recognized himself, somewhere between Ray the homeless man and Robert the millionaire. He took a deep breath and walked inside. The lobby was modest but clean, with fresh flowers on the front desk and soft music playing. It wasn't a luxury hotel, but it had an atmosphere of simple dignity. "Can I help you?" asked the woman at the front desk. "I have an interview with Linda at 2 o'clock, Ray explained. "For the night clerk position?" The woman's expression shifted subtly, not unkind, but careful. "You're Grace's friend?" "Yes," Ray nodded. "She started working here yesterday." "She's doing great already," the woman said with a genuine smile. "I'll let Linda know you're here." Ray waited in a small office off the lobby, rehearsing what he would say. His original plan had been to go through with the interview, then reveal his true identity to the manager afterward, and discuss how to improve their employment program. But now, sitting here, that approach felt wrong. It would make his entire experience seem like a game, diminishing the real struggles of those he'd met. "You must be Ray," said a woman entering the office. She was in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "I'm Linda Peterson, the hotel manager. Grace has told me good things about you." They shook hands, and Linda gestured for him to sit. "Before we start," Ray said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you." Linda raised an eyebrow but waited for him to continue. "I haven't been completely honest about who I am." Ray took a deep breath. "My name is Robert Chen. I run Chen Technologies." Linda's eyes widened in recognition. "The software company? That Robert Chen?" Ray nodded. 2 weeks ago, I decided to experience homelessness firsthand to understand the issues better. I didn't expect to meet someone like Grace or to be sitting here now." He waited for Linda's reaction. Anger, perhaps, or a sense of betrayal on Grace's behalf. Instead, Linda leaned back in her chair, studying him thoughtfully. "That explains a few things. Grace mentioned you seemed educated, that you gave good advice to others at the shelter." She paused. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I respect what you're doing here," Ray answered honestly. "This employee housing program, giving people like Grace a real chance, it matters. And I want to learn from it, maybe even help expand it." Linda nodded slowly. "It's not charity, Mr. Chen, it's good business. People like Grace become loyal, hard-working employees when given a fair opportunity. The housing program reduces turnover, which saves us money in the long run." "Exactly. Ray agreed eagerly. Dignity and opportunity are more valuable than handouts. That's what I've learned these past 2 weeks. So what happens now? Linda asked. You go back to your penthouse and write us a check? There was a challenge in her voice that Ray appreciated. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She wanted to know if his intentions were genuine. I want to do more than that, Ray said. But first, there's someone I need to speak with. He hesitated. Grace deserves to hear the truth from me, not as office gossip. Linda considered this, then nodded. She's working on the 3rd floor. I'll call her down. While Linda stepped out to make the call, Ray's heart raced. Would Grace feel betrayed? Would she understand why he'd kept his identity secret? He wouldn't blame her if she walked out and never spoke to him again. A few minutes later, Grace appeared in the doorway, her face concerned. Linda said you needed to talk to me. Did something happen with the interview? Ray gestured for her to sit. There's not going to be an interview, Grace. I haven't been honest with you about who I am. Slowly, carefully, he explained everything, who he really was, why he'd gone undercover, what he'd learned. As he spoke, Grace's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something he couldn't quite read. When he finished, the silence between them felt heavy. So everything was fake? She finally asked, her voice quiet. Our friendship, the conversations, all of it? No, Ray said firmly. That was the most real thing about this experience. You showed me kindness when you thought I had nothing to offer in return. You helped me when you barely had enough for yourself. Grace looked away. I feel foolish. Please don't. Ray leaned forward. You have nothing to be embarrassed about. I'm the one who should apologize. What now? Grace asked, still not meeting his eyes. You go back to your life and I keep scrubbing toilets? That's up to you, Ray replied. Your job here is secure. I've already discussed that with Linda. But I'd like to offer you something else if you're interested. Grace finally looked at him. What? A partnership, Ray said simply. Remember that mentorship program we talked about? The chain of support for people experiencing homelessness? I want to make it real and I want you to help me build it. Why me? Because you understand what people really need in a way I never could, even after these 2 weeks. You have the experience, the compassion, and the practical knowledge. I have the resources. Together, we could create something that actually works. Grace was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. I need time to think about this. It's a lot to take in. Of course, Ray nodded. Take all the time you need. The offer won't expire. He wrote his real phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to her. Whatever you decide about working with me, I hope you'll stay in touch. Your friendship means a lot to me. Grace took the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket. I need to get back to work now. Thank you for listening, Ray said as she stood to leave. At the door, Grace paused. You know, Robert, you could have just donated money without all this undercover stuff. I've donated millions over the years, he admitted. But I never understood what I was donating to. Now I do. Grace nodded once, then left, closing the door behind her. 3 months later, Robert Chen stood in the lobby of a renovated apartment building, watching as a family carried their belongings into their new home. The building had once been an abandoned office space but was now 20 affordable housing units with an on-site job training center. They're the 5th family this week, said a voice beside him. Robert turned to see Grace, clipboard in hand, checking off items on her list. After 2 weeks of silence following his revelation, she had called him with conditions for their partnership. She would help design and run the program, but she wanted real authority, not just a figurehead position, and the program had to focus on dignity and self-sufficiency, not charity. Robert had agreed to everything without hesitation. How are they doing? He asked, nodding toward the family. The father starts his new job on Monday, Grace reported. The mother is enrolled in our computer skills class. The kids are signed up for the after-school program. And they're paying rent? Grace nodded. 30% of their income as agreed. They're proud to be paying their own way. They walked together through the building, checking on the day's progress. The job training center was busy with people learning various skills: computer literacy, customer service, basic accounting. In another room, volunteers from Robert's company were conducting mock interviews with program participants. Joe called this morning, Grace mentioned as they headed upstairs. He's settling into his new place. Says his back feels better with a real bed. Robert smiled. Joe had been among the first people they'd reached out to when the program launched. Now he helped manage the building's maintenance needs using his construction knowledge despite his physical limitations. And Harold? Robert asked. Still doing well at the bookstore job. The owner says his literature knowledge is impressive. He hasn't missed a day of work or his therapy appointments. They reached the rooftop where a community garden was taking shape. Residents were planting vegetables and flowers in raised beds, creating beauty and food security in one project. Robert watched the activity with satisfaction. In 3 months, they had accomplished more meaningful change than his foundation had in years of traditional charity work. The board was skeptical at first, he admitted to Grace. They thought I'd lost my mind during my sabbatical. And now? Now they're seeing the results. It's not just about helping people, it's changing how we do business. That new hiring program we started has brought in some incredible talent we would have missed before. Grace nodded. People just need a chance, like I keep telling you. They stood in comfortable silence watching the sunset over the city. Robert thought about how much his life had changed since that first night at the shelter. His company was thriving with its new sense of purpose. His employees were more engaged than ever, and he had found a kind of fulfillment that no business success had ever provided. We need to talk about expanding, Grace said, interrupting his thoughts. I have 10 more families qualified for housing but no available units. I might have a solution, Robert replied. There's a building for sale 3 blocks over. Similar layout, good condition. We could have it ready in 2 months if we move quickly. Grace made a note on her clipboard. I'll start preparing the families. Several of them were already in our job training program. As they headed back downstairs, they passed a bulletin board covered with photos. Residents at work, children playing in the new playground, seniors tending the garden. In the center was a group photo from their opening day celebration, with Robert and Grace cutting the ribbon together. Do you ever miss your old life? Grace asked suddenly. The penthouse, the fancy restaurants, the board meetings. Robert considered the question. I still have board meetings, he pointed out with a smile. But no, I don't miss the rest of it. That life was comfortable but empty. And this isn't? Robert gestured around them at the building, humming with life and possibility. This has purpose. And real friendships. I'm happier now than I've been in years. As they reached the lobby, a woman approached Grace with questions about the after-school program. Robert stepped aside, watching as Grace patiently explained the details. Her natural leadership abilities had flourished these past months as she'd grown confident in her role. Outside, the street was busy with people heading home from work. Robert remembered how it felt to be invisible on these same streets, how people had looked through him rather than at him. Now he made a point of seeing everyone he passed, of acknowledging their humanity with a nod or smile. It was a small thing, perhaps, but he had learned that small things mattered. A shared sandwich, a tube of ointment for blisters, a moment of genuine connection. These were the building blocks of dignity and hope. And in the end, that was what his experiment had truly been about. Not testing others' kindness, but finding his own humanity again.